I am the executive director for America's Watershed Initiative. We are a Mississippi River watershed wide NGO. We focus on two things: science and data to inform decision making, and we promote collaboration for on the ground action. So this series of lunchtime webinars really gets at our goal to provide great science from leaders in the basin to a wide diversity of audiences. So we're really pleased to have with us today Jason Knouft. Jason is a professor in the Department of Biology at St. Louis University and Director of Freshwater Policy at the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. He has a BS and MS in biology from Drexel and his PhD from University of Illinois. And his research interests focus on impacts of human activities on freshwater resources with a focus on climate change, land use transformations, and climate adaptation strategies to address these issues. So we're just delighted to have you with us today, Jason, and over to you.
Great. Thanks, Kim, and I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak today. And so, as Kim mentioned, what I'm going to talk about is some work we've done fairly recently on trying to estimate changes in discharge and water temperature across the Mississippi River watershed. And so, as we all know, the Mississippi Basin is a very large place. So trying to get into details about these, the issue of changes in river flows and water temperatures it's pretty overwhelming, and so I'm gonna try and give just an overview of what we've done, and how we think about applying these data to future projections about what's potentially going to happen in the basin in the next 10, 20, 50 years. So just to frame this in the perspective that I tend to bring to my work is, I often think about the issue of water security and how we maintain water security, because it's fundamentally important to so many different aspects of our life. And so if we think about the UN definition, it's essentially the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water. And so this allows for, to facilitate healthy livelihoods, socioeconomic development, and, protect against waterborne pollution and disease. So when we don't, water is one of the most is one of the most fundamental needs that people have and of society. And so the challenge with water access, as it relates to water security and even national security, is that when the government is not able to provide access to clean water, essentially what happens is that members of society think like, well, if the government can't give me this most basic need that I have, how can I trust them to do anything else? And so what happens then is people tend to become disengaged in government, and that is a problem for our democratic process. And so, there's an interesting book called The Prophets of Distrust, where the authors focus on this idea that people who drink bottled water are less engaged in government. And the reason for that is that they don't trust their local water supplies, and there's this relationship. And so they have to move to bottled water. And so there's a cost to that, and there's a relationship between that transition and, people's trust in the government. So what happens when, people perceive their water security to be threatened? Users tend to deplete, this common resource to a greater extent under time pressure, and then conflict arises when mechanisms for management and resolution are unavailable. And so I think about this in terms of, future water resources, is that, if society starts perceiving that our water resources are becoming more and more threatened because of changes in climate or intense weather events or whatever stresses we put on our freshwater systems, it sort of leads to a whole cascading array of events. And so, we're in a different time now where we have to be more proactive and thinking more into the future about how we maintain water security. And so part of that need was the impetus for us to start this project we called Hydroclimb, and it was funded by NSF. And the goal of Hydroclimb was to generate monthly discharge and water temperature data from 1950 to 2099 for all major watersheds across the U.S. and Canada. And so this map just represents all the watersheds that we modeled. And so we generated data at the stream segment scale, which essentially, I mean, it depends on the resolution of each watershed, but it's generating stream flow or discharge data and water temperature data in every section of stream or river above and below another tributary coming into that stream section. So it's an enormous amount of data. So you imagine there are 39 different global climate model projections, so different models and different greenhouse gas concentration scenarios from 1950 to 2099. And from 2015 to 2099 is when we start getting into using climate projection data to drive the models. And so we use SWAT, the Soil Water Assessment Tool, to as our model to generate these data. The reason for this is that climate projections are easily input, and the other data are readily available. So weather, soil, land use, topography, and it gives us the opportunity for long-term simulations. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is the Mobile Basin, which I recognize is not within the Mississippi, but these were some figures I had. But anyway, what you can see is that the darker blue lines are areas with higher discharge, and the lighter blue lines are, your smaller streams. And then we also have water temperature. So the bluer areas are cooler sections, and the red areas are where we see warmer water temperatures. So these are what the data look like, at least visualized. So if we come to the Mississippi Basin, and this is the big overview that we have. And again, there's so much data that I just condensed this down to a single time slice comparison using data from a single global climate model with a single greenhouse gas concentration. And so I just want to walk you through this. What we did was we generated data from 2000 to 2010 based on actual weather data. And then we generated similar data from 2040 to 2050 based on climate projections. And then what we did was we compared the outputs from the SWAT model 2040 to 2050 to those from 2000 to 2010 to see how stream flow was going to change based on these future projections. And so anywhere that's blue or light blue is where we see an average annual increase in stream flow or discharge. And so that's a very sort of coarse estimate of what's going on in the river. So it doesn't take into account seasonality. It doesn't take into account extremes. It doesn't take into account, whether or not there's seasonal shifts in river flow patterns. But essentially what this gives us is a very broad view of what's happening in different parts of the watershed on average during these different time periods. And if we look at water temperature, it's a similar sort of presentation. We're comparing 2000 to 2010 with what's projected to happen in 2040 to 2050. And so these are not changes in air temperature. These are changes in water temperature based on air temperature, groundwater inputs, the temperature of the water coming in from upstream, and things like precipitation and snowmelt. So what you can see is there across the entire basin, we're seeing increases in water temperature. It ranges from, maybe about 0.3 degree increase in water temperature up to, up maybe 1.5 degrees or more. And so we've got this very broad perspective on what might be happening in the future. And so then the question is, like, what can we do? And what can we do to mitigate these changes? And so and how can these strategies or adaptation strategies be durable as climate changes? And so what we've done, and I just want to give you a couple examples, let's say we want to think about green infrastructure and adding riparian buffers to the sides of streams. Well, we can go in and focus these SWOT models on a particular region. And so in our case, we focused on the Merrimack River watershed, which is just south of St. Louis. And this was work we did with the Nature Conservancy. And so the Merrimack is it's we'll call it our home watershed, and it's an important source of drinking water, and the land cover is relatively intact. But what we can do is we can virtually ask questions of our models. So for example, we can run our SWOT model, and then we can virtually plant riparian vegetation in that model and run it again and compare what happens to stream flow and sediment when these buffers are added. And so what we found that was what I thought was pretty interesting is if we look at one of the subbasins in the Merrimack, adding this riparian vegetation didn't really have much effect on changes in sediment or nitrogen or phosphorus. But in other parts of the watershed, we saw real significant improvements. And then what we can do is project these changes over time into the future and ask, okay, a riparian zone or an increased riparian buffer zone might help now, but what happens 20, 30 years from now when we get more intense rainfall events? And so I don't have time to go into that, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about it if needed. And then we also used a different model to ask the question, well, if we do add this green infrastructure or these riparian buffers, can that have any impact on water temperature? And so, the trees essentially provide shading and can cool the water. And we can go in and we can virtually say, okay, what if we have 10% shading or along the stream, if we have 50% shading due to a fortified riparian zone, or 90% shading, what does that do to the water temperature along the distance of the stream segment that we're interested in? And what we found is that, as you'd expect, if you've got really good shading, it maintains a lower and stable water temperature. And I have this picture of a smallmouth bass here because this 27 degrees Celsius line is a thermal threshold where the growth of smallmouth bass are impacted. And so we were trying to understand, could we take this virtual approach to understanding what this green infrastructure, these streamside modifications might do in the future in terms of preserving a fishery. And so I won't, again, because of time, I'm not going to get into the results and the data, but what we actually found, and this is an extreme event, obviously, we're going from basically like a ditch behind a strip mall to a really intact forest, and that's likely not going to happen. But what we found is that if we increase the size of the buffer in areas where there really was no vegetation, the decrease in water temperature associated with adding that riparian shading could actually compensate for the increases in water temperature we were going to see due to climate change in the next 20 or 30 years. So again, all of the things I'm talking about here are models and future projections, but at least it gives us some sort of framework for understanding, place-based impacts of remediation and adapting to climate change, and what, where we might best focus our efforts. So I'm going to wrap up there and just acknowledge several of the people that contributed to this work and the funding agencies and so forth. And with that, I think I'll just open it up for questions and any sort of discussion that we might have on, how we use these data and apply these data. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that the entire basin model was driven using CMIP 5 data. and we're in the process of updating that model with the CMIC 6 projections or estimates. And so those results are forthcoming. So anyway, thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. So I have one question that came in prior to our meeting, and I'll get to the ones that came in since. The first question, can you tell us about potential low water events on the upper Mississippi River? What conditions might lead to a critically low water levels on the UMR, especially the impounded reaches where we have locks and dams for water level management?
So to answer the first part of that question, no, I cannot tell you about that because, I mean, the thing I think we really need to understand is that these are just model projections, and the resolution of the temporal and spatial resolution of the climate data are not going to allow us to say, in 2028, these are the areas that we really need to be concerned about. Just looking at the model outputs, the main drivers of changes in discharge are precipitation patterns and then temperature, which causes evaporation and loss of water. And so it really, if we've been looking the past few years in the Mississippi Basin, it depends. Like, are droughts coming in the Ohio, up in maybe Minnesota or Wisconsin? Are they coming from the Missouri River part of the watershed? So, I mean, I think we really see the greatest impacts, as you can imagine, when, at least two or three of those, we'll call them subbasins, I guess, are experiencing drought. And that's when we see, the low water issues becoming most apparent. But to maybe address the second part of that question, I think we need to recognize that, if we have a framework for understanding how climate may impact these resources, or, our rivers and river flows and even water temperature, maybe we can say, well, there's a higher probability in this region that we'll see droughts or low water events over the next 10 or 20 years. And so what are the implications of, for impoundments, for example, or what are the implications for, putting a data center on the side of the river in terms of how much water that data center might pull out of the river. So I think, we have to think about these models for the information they can provide us. And it's really, I'll call them long-term estimates of the likelihood that some event is going to happen over, some period of time. And then that can allow us to target regions that we think might deserve more attention. And this is, I mean, the one thing I recognize about this is a very different way of thinking about how we manage our rivers and manage the landscape, because what we're doing is opposed to using past data to understand these things, and we know that event happened and we know what the response was in the past, we're looking into the future based on a non-stationary climate where we have to kind of guess, and our best guess can then be informed by model outputs.
Great, thank you. Next question. Do the SWOT models include reservoirs and reservoir operating rules?
They can, but in our models, we did not include them because it was just overwhelming for model setup and for running the models. And so, but what we've used them for is so these are, I mean, you can think about these as like, there are smaller models throughout the entire Mississippi Basin. And what you can do is focus in on a particular region and then refine those models to add in things like reservoir function, and whatever, maybe you want to put a data center on there, for example. If I'll come back to that example and say, okay, we're going to get water extracted at this rate from this location, what's that going to do to the downstream areas? And so when we're dealing with models over this broad of a geographic area, it's really hard to to add as much detail as probably needed for management decisions at a very local scale.
Great, thank you. Next question is a request to provide some additional commentary regarding the projection of low flows in the upper Midwest. That seems somewhat counter to current long-term trends for the upper Mississippi, which may reflect broader changes in the drainage basin. I'm interested what is expected to reverse those trends.
I'd have to dig back into the model, but generally when we were looking at the outputs, a lot of it has to do with increased temperatures and changing rainfall patterns. But the increased temperatures and the resulting loss of water due to evaporation was frankly more significant than I thought it would be.
Great, thank you. Does the SWOT model allow modifications in land cover to influence water routing, for example, infiltration or runoff?
Yes, and that the that's what we did when I was showing the virtual trees like falling from the sky onto the landscape. Is what we can do is effectively virtually change the land cover and then rerun the model. And then we ask, okay, um, based on the physical makeup of this model and infiltration rates and runoff rates being changed by adding, trees, for example, what does that do to the outputs of the SWOT model, whether it be like stream flow or what? Well, it doesn't deal with water temperature in that way, but we've also looked at sediment and nitrogen and phosphorus. So yes, you can look at the land cover. And I know we don't have too much time, and I could talk for a long time about what, it's really interesting. Like the interaction between future climate and changes in land cover and the place-based nature of those interactions is really, it's complicated, but it's really interesting, and it's really it really suggests the need for this sort of a basin-wide modeling approach to understanding what's happening in the future. But the signal of climate is so strong that we simply can't say it's going to rain more. We need to do what we used to do to deal with heavy rainfall. We can't do that anymore because it's not going to work in the future in the same way that it has in the past.
Great. Next question. Do you know if the stream flow and temperature projections in your paper were consistent with projections in the 2023 National Climate Assessment?
We didn't compare them, but so I think the National Climate Assessment was based on a more, I don't want to say linear, but a direct relationship between air temperature and water temperature. So what the water temperature model we used was developed by my collaborator, Darren Ficklin at Indiana University, and it takes into account things like snow melt, groundwater inputs, like air temperature, upstream water volume, and water temperature. So they're different than that assessment. I have this whole graph I can show about why I think that approach is better, where you sort of partition in these different components. And so I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but I think what we need to really consider is what is the best way to represent water temperature in a model, or the best way to predict or estimate water temperature in a model. And I'm not implying that the way we did it was the best. I think there are better ways to do it, and there are pretty important limitations to the way we estimated water temperature at the basin-wide scale. So the short answer is I didn't compare the climate assessment directly, but my guess is that they're quite different. And my guess is ours are actually a little bit lower.
Can you describe the model performance over the observed period of record? Did performance vary geographically or over time?
Uh, it's such a big area that it didn't, it definitely varied over geographic space. I don't think it varied over time. And the reason that it varies over space is either dependent on how many USGS stream gauges were available to run the model or to calibrate and validate, well, really calibrate the model. Um, and some areas there's a lot more gauges than other areas. And then you get into situations, I'm not sure, I have to think about the Mississippi basin in particular, but when you get into more lowland areas, it becomes the model doesn't perform as well. Like we did this work up on watersheds, like an extreme example is Alaska. And it was like the models performed really badly up there because it's so like swampy and that kind of stuff. So yeah, they definitely varied through space, geographic space, but through time, not, no, I don't recall there being a time component.
A question about the Ohio Basin. The Ohio Basin is showing increased flow, but appears the main stem area is projected to see decreased discharge. Do you attribute that entirely to evapotranspiration along the flow path from surface water due to increased temperature?
I don't know. I mean, if you just asked me to take a guess, that would probably be my guess. But like I would have to go back and look at it in detail.
In agricultural land use settings, in your search or in other studies, did you see any information pertaining to base flow increased from increased infiltration and percolation?
So can you read? I'm sorry, Kim, can you read that again? I thought that question was going to go in a different direction, and so I wasn't thinking.
No worries. In agriculture land use settings, in your search of other studies, did you see any information pertaining to base flow increase from increased infiltration and percolation?
I don't recall seeing that, but that doesn't mean that somebody hasn't looked at that. So I don't know offhand.
Another question, we're getting close, so this may be the last one for today. Did you look at other management actions in addition to riparian buffers? And are you trying to understand the effectiveness, i.e. reducing peak flows, reduced nutrients of such actions at different scales of adoption?
Yes, we did. And I can't, and so the Nature Conservancy study of the Merrimack is where we did most of is where we looked at multiple different approaches to mitigation and green infrastructure. And I can't um oh gosh, I can't remember what all the other options were that we looked at. Um, but we ended up, so yes, we looked at that and as you can imagine, different approaches work differently. But this was long, like this was before COVID. So everything becomes a blur. But I just remember that, as you'd expect, like the different management options produce different outcomes, and we could sort of rank the different management options and their effectiveness. And so you can definitely do that, I guess would be the answer to that question. And we did it. And I remember riparian buffers were the most consistently effective, but there were also like it depended on where you were in the watershed and then we started getting into conversations with the Nature Conservancy about cost versus effectiveness and willingness to adopt and those types of things. So you can definitely do it, and it becomes a very interesting conversation.
Great. Well, I'm sorry to the folks that we had a couple questions we couldn't get to. we'll pass those on to Dr. Knouft, and we'll see if we can get you an answer offline. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jason, and all of you who are on the line today. And next month, September, believe it or not, next month is going to be Dr. Robert Jacobson. He'll be talking about pallid sturgeon in the basin. So thanks again to everybody, and we hope we'll see you in September.